We're looking at Greek and Roman culture in the first century Mediterranean world. This is part of our ongoing series, Bible Background Studies. Some of the upcoming lessons that we'll be looking at will be some occupations in the Bible. We've touched on it at various times, farming and so on, but we'll have more to say about various occupations in coming weeks. And there's a few other areas that we want to hit as well. So this morning, Greek and Roman culture in the first century Mediterranean world. And when we talk about Greek and Roman culture, one of the first things we need to identify is that Greek and Roman culture largely overlap. They're not quite identical, but the Romans, who rose to power in roughly 200 BC or thereabouts, earlier than that, but by the time they became a real powerhouse in the Mediterranean world, about 200 BC, they adopted and adapted and utilized the culture that had swept across the Mediterranean world just before them, and that would be the Greek culture. And the Greek culture was propagated across the known world. So the entire Mediterranean world, from Spain and as far away as the British Isles in the west, all the way to Afghanistan and India in the east, all of that territory became a repository for Greek culture, and that was largely due to a single man. We call him the Great. Who would that be? Alexander the Great, 330 BC, and he began his conquest in 330 BC. He's actually more technically accurately a Macedonian, but the language that he speaks is Greek, and wherever he goes, he actually begins the process of, technically it's called Hellenization. Hellen meaning Greek. So Hellenistic culture is a fancier term for Greek culture. And so Alexander the Great is introducing Greek language, Greek institutions, Greek ideas, Greek art and architecture wherever he goes. One of the greatest cities that he founded actually bears his name, Alexandria, Egypt. And it became a port city, a major port city in the Nile Delta. And it had a huge library, probably the largest library in the ancient world. And wherever Alexander went, he brought Greek education systems, Greek ideas, all the way to India, which is incredible to contemplate. So when we talk about Roman culture, the Romans are going to adapt and borrow. They don't have a lot of their own ideas, but they're taking Greek culture and Greek ideas and popularizing them and bringing them to the masses. So there's a large overlap. So here's some things we're going to talk about this morning. Alexander the Great's conquest of Syria, because specifically we're looking at Greek and Roman culture in relationship to the Bible, to the Old and New Testaments. The Roman conquest of Judah, culture in general, languages, religion, and the Pax Romana. So here's a rough timeline. Alexander the Great conquers Syria, including Judea, in 333 BC. He was lightning fast. He swept over everything that he tried to do. He pretty much accomplished it. Among the more amazing conquest in the Eastern Mediterranean was the conquest of Tyre. Tyre was an island fortress. It had very stout walls, and it was off the coast by several hundred yards, like half a mile or something like that. And when Alexander began sweeping up the coast, he threatened Tyre and said, "Surrender, or I'm going to knock you down." And the Tyrians said, "You'll never take us. You can't do an amphibious landing because there's no beach. You can't get at us." And they essentially thumbed their nose at Alexander and his armies. And so Alexander said, I got to take him now because if it becomes known that one city held out against me, that will inspire others to resist. That's not part of the program. So this is Alexander. He built a mole. A mole is a causeway. He had his soldiers and slaves that he had already conquered start carrying bushel baskets of dirt. And they built a causeway, a road, from the mainland to the island so that he could march his troops out, and more importantly, his siege engines, battering rams, catapult, ballistae. And as the mole got closer and closer, the Tyrians began to say, we could negotiate, we could talk a little. And he said, no, the time for talking is done. He destroyed it. He knocked it down. He killed most of the people there. The rest were carted off into slavery. This is Alexander. So he is a megalomaniac, if there ever was one. And so whatever he did completely, thoroughly, and fast. In fact, you remember in Daniel chapter 7, one of the two, the vision of the beasts, a prophetic vision of the animals. And one of the visions has to do with the Greek Empire, Alexander. It was the leopard, speed, fast. So Alexander died suddenly in 323 BC. He was, I think, 33 years old. And he had gone from Greece, Macedonia, to India. And they're on their way back because Alexander's armies said, we're sick of fighting. We've been with you all this time. We want to go home. And so he had turned around. He had other plans. He was going to keep on going. But he turned around and started west, and he died. Some say he was assassinated. Some say, it was other things. But anyhow, he died. When he died, he did not leave a living heir who was capable of taking the reins of his empire. So it split up into four empires, each of which is a huge chunk of territory. And the two that concern us, the two empires that concern us, are the Ptolemaic Empire, Egypt, and the Seleucid Empire. And that would be Syria, Turkey, really Babylon, all the way to the Indus River in India. And eventually, things begin to crack up and degrade and so on. But those two empires are gonna fight each other over the course of the next couple of centuries for control of the Middle East. So in 167, there was a revolt by the Maccabees in Jerusalem and Judea, and that revolt ended up in what's called the Hasmonean Kingdom, lasted until 63 BC. And then the Romans came into Judea in 63 BC, conquered Jerusalem, took over the control of the country, and Herod is crowned king of Judea. So that's Herod the Great. There are a lot of Herods in the Bible, but this is Herod the Great, who was king of Judea when Jesus was born. He died in like 4 AD or something like that. So Hellenistic Judea. From Alexander the Great's conquest of the territory of Syria in 333 to 332 BC, Hellenistic or Greek language, culture, and influence spread throughout Judea, Samaria, and Galilee. So this is part of Alexander's plan. Wherever he goes, he actually brings architects, artists, and teachers with him on his conquest. And he has them kind of spin off as he moves through the territory to start schools and institutions and so on. That's part of his program. So architecture, literature, cultural practices, and connections to the Gentile world followed in the wake of Alexander's conquests. So, the Jews had been kind of isolated. Now, why would that be the case? Why would Israel be somewhat, not completely, but somewhat isolated from the Gentile world? Why do you think? In previous centuries. God told them, don't intermarry. Don't marry Gentiles. Don't worship like them. Don't hang out with them. So certainly there was trade. They were buying and selling commodities and luxury items and so on. There was interaction. But God had specifically said, you're not to be like them, and don't let your daughters marry their sons and vice versa. Don't do that. So there had been somewhat of an isolation or a separation between Israel and the rest of the world up until this time. Now, as Greek culture began to take hold in Judea, the upper class Jews, so these would be wealthy people, merchants, landowners, nobility, people who had money and wealth and power and status, they began to see the advantages and the luxury of a Hellenistic lifestyle. And so they began to be interested in learning the Greek language, in fitting into a Greek world. And so one of the things they did, among others, was they sent their eldest sons to Greek schools, either in the area or all the way back to Greece and Macedonia. And so these sons are going to learn this is how you behave like a Greek. This is culture. It'd be similar, I suppose. New Hampshire has a couple of very famous boarding schools. Phillips Exeter, that's a big one down in Exeter, I guess it is, isn't it? And I think there's others too, but this would be where the muckety mucks send their kids. People who are millionaires and they're movers and shakers in culture. They send their kids to a boarding school like that because they're getting set up for a lifetime of whatever it is that class of people does. Well, something like that is going on here. So they're getting sent to Greek schools to be educated. And these boys who come back to Judea are probably the origin of the Hellenistic Jews and the Herodians. So in the time of Jesus, there are Pharisees and Sadducees, there are nationalists, there are Essenes, there's lots of different groups of people, but one of the groups of people that, and again, they'd be wealthy, they'd be elite, would be the Herodians. What do you suppose that name means? What does that imply, the Herodians? Their followers they're supporters of Herod. They're tied into his family either by marriage or whatever, or they just say, this is what our class of people does. We're wealthy, we're powerful, we own land, we have a household staff of 80 or 100, and we're rich, and this is what we do. And so there were Jews who liked it. They liked the Hellenistic culture. They liked the fashions. They liked the architecture. They liked the lifestyle. So, in our own country, there have been people who came from nothing. They were dirt poor, and they got involved in railroads in the late 1800s, or steel mills in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or oil industry, and they became fabulously wealthy. The Carnegies and the Rockefellers and all these, and these people, they came from nothing, but when they get to a certain status, now they wear the finest clothes. They eat the finest foods. They associate with the finest people. And that's what's going on here too, among the Jews. After the breakup of Alexander's empire into 4 parts, there's a fierce struggle between the Seleucid kingdom in the east and the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt. As was often the case, down through history, it's been true all the way up to and including yesterday. You might have seen that there was a terrorist attack in Tel Aviv, Israel, and a security guard noticed a man behaving suspiciously. He approached him. The Palestinian turned out to be a terrorist who shot him and killed the Israeli security officer. The terrorist was himself killed. This conflict is still there. And on a broader geopolitical scale, Israel, because it's at the juncture of Europe, Asia, Africa, and empires often meet right there to do their battles, going way back into history, is true this time too. So the Seleucid Emperor Antiochus IV Epiphanes ruled from 175 to 164 BC, was very cruel to the Jews of Judea, tried to forcibly stop the sacrifices in the temple, forbade Jewish religious practices, killed hundreds, thousands of Jews, and the ultimate desecration that he performed was not only did he order all kinds of Jewish practices to stop. He burned copies of the Torah. He persecuted people who were trying to observe Sabbath and so on. But the ultimate thing was he ordered a pig to be sacrificed on the altar in the temple. And obviously to Jews that's like, you know, the most horrific thing that you can imagine. And the high priest, a Jew, said, I'm not going to do that. He got killed. And that resulted in a priestly family, the Maccabees, rising up and leading a guerrilla war against the Seleucids for the next generation or two or three. And so the Maccabean revolt started in 167 BC. It started out just as guerrilla tactics out in the hillsides, ambushing troops and so on. It grew into a general conflagration. The main conflict lasted 167, 160. The Seleucids were still maintaining control. The war was Jews against the Seleucids and against Hellenized Jews. So Jews who loved their own country, some of them would have been religious, some of them would have been observant, and they knew and loved Yahweh. Some of them would not have been. But they are resentful not only of the Seleucids, but also of the Jews who have taken the part of the Hellenistic culture. So these guerrillas and just the general population is rising up against that. So in 164, this is after the temple had been desecrated for 3 years, and there was no sacrifice going on. There was no worship. The countryside was in shambles. It was not safe to go out. And finally, they regained control of the temple precinct, and they went in to do the ceremonies for restarting, for cleansing, ceremonially cleansing the temple. One of the things that had to happen was the lighting of the sacred lamp, the menorah. And there was only enough oil for 1 day of burning the lamp. And according to Jewish tradition, and it could well have been true, God performed a miracle, and that 1 day's worth of oil lasted for 8 days, so that they could finish the cleansing of the temple. That became what today is known as Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights. And it does look like, it's not mentioned anywhere in the Old Testament, and there's only one reference to it in the New Testament, and kind of a glancing reference. In the Gospel of John, it looks like one of the festivals that Jesus went to was, in fact, Hanukkah. So this conflict resulted in various phases until 134 BC, when the Jews regained their independence. Now that's remarkable. Why? 134 BC, they now have their own country again. It's pretty beat up. It's small. It's just really Judah or Judea, so it's the southern part. But why is that remarkable? First time in having their own kingdom since 586, when Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, swept through and destroyed everything. So that's the first time they've been their own people, their own nation, for several hundred years. So remarkable. The Maccabean family. So Maccabee means the hammer. And the Maccabees took control of the high priesthood of Jerusalem. They really weren't supposed to. They don't have the proper lineage. They were Levites, but they weren't from Zadok. And so they legally probably shouldn't have done that. And this leads to further issues. Over time, the family sees this position not as a religious position to worship God, to lead the people in worshiping God, to offer appropriate sacrifices at the right time. The family begins to see this as a political position. And this is the power. And it was. It essentially became a king, a dictator. And as this is going on over several generations, the family, the Maccabee family, is getting more and more secular, more and more power hungry, and frankly, more and more pagan, which, is ironic because the whole Maccabean revolt started from telling Antiochus Epiphanes, we're not going to sacrifice a pig on our altar. And now they themselves are becoming more and more pagan in their outlook. So, two branches of the Hasmoneans, or the Maccabean family, are at war with each other. They're arguing and fighting over who gets to be in charge of things. And they agree, let's have an outside arbiter come in and settle this dispute for us. And the guy they picked was a man who was very, very famous in the Mediterranean world. He was a Roman general named Pompey. He had fought many, many battles, was victorious. He was a political insider in the Roman Republic. And so they asked him to intervene, and he did. He brought troops. And he said, I can settle this. I can settle it for you right now. And he took over Jerusalem. So they invited the Romans in, and the Romans didn't leave for 400 years. This is why when you get to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's already a done deal that the Jews are under the thumb of the Romans. The Romans are occupying Israeli territory. Judea, Samaria, Galilee, and all the surrounding territories. There are Roman troops, Roman governors or kings, Roman procurators, and so on. The Roman government apparatus is there and functioning when the Gospel of Matthew opens up. And it's been there since 63 BC. So that's, it's a done deal. There's no record in the Bible of the conquest of Jerusalem by Pompey, but it happened in 63 BC, and now the Romans are there, and they're running things. One of the things that happened that kind of symbolizes the issues that would define the whole relationship was it's customary for a Roman general who has just won a battle and conquered a city to go into the city's temple or temples, and he's doing two things. One is he's showing, my gods are stronger than your gods. And the second thing he's doing is, Romans actually were quite religious people. And so he's kind of, as a courtesy, saying, I recognize that you local people that I have just conquered, you have your own religion, and so as a courtesy, I'm making a call on your God. Well, he went into the temple in Jerusalem, and he went into the holy place, and then he went into the Holy of Holies. And in his mind, he's just doing what Roman generals do. In the minds of the Jews, what are they thinking? You are the most sacrilegious pagan the world has ever seen. And it sets the tone for the next 400 years. The Jews are looking at the Romans, and the Romans were pagans. They worshiped a whole raft of gods, and they had other things going on the edges of their religious psyche. They were pagans. They were Gentiles. And they did not have any right to go into the holy place or the most holy. But in their mind, you know, these backward Jews are just ignorant, strange, weird people. And why can't they get along with us? We conquered them, we own them. So there's this disconnect where the Romans have one worldview and the Jews have a very different one. So in Judea, Samaria, and Galilee, Roman rule in that territory, as well as Perea, Decapolis, Idumea, lasted from 63 BC until about 390 AD, with two brief rebellions. The first Jewish war, which you probably have heard about, 63 to 67, this is when the temple got destroyed. You've probably heard of Masada. The last holdouts went up to the top of this plateau down by the Dead Sea, and as the Romans, Titus was the general's name, as the Romans came up to kill them, they committed mass suicide. So that's the first Jewish war.
It actually built from giant crimson ramp.
Correct. So because it was on a 1,500-foot high plateau, the Romans, there's only just one snake path to get up to it. The Romans used Jewish slave labor to construct a ramp so that they could get battering rams and troops up there. And then they began to burn down the gates of this fortress. So that's the first Jewish war, and it resulted in Israel once again no longer existing. There were thousands of slaves taken out of Israel. And then again, another half century or so later, the Bar Kokhba revolt. This is another revolt. The Jews, are you catching a pattern here? The Jews, once again, are unhappy with the Romans. There's a guy by the name of Bar Kokhba who is a messianic figure. Actually, even to today, there are some Jews who think that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah and that he's the anointed one. Anyhow, people rallied around him, and they did win their independence once again for a short period of time. So kings like Herod, governors like Pilate, were appointed by the Roman government, either the Roman Senate or later on the Roman emperor. So these guys were installed by so what would be another word for that when a foreign government installs somebody as head of state over you? A coup or a puppet figurehead. So yes, Herod is a king, and he does have some autonomy, but you know, if he's going to do anything big, he's got to get it approved by Rome. So the Romans are fully in charge. So there were Roman military garrisons throughout Judea, Galilee, Samaria, and the surrounding territories. In Jerusalem, a large number of Roman legionaries were posted in the Antonia fortress overlooking the temple courtyards. So we'll see a picture of that momentarily. So here is the territory of Judea, due north of it, Samaria, and then the lighter colored, farther north, Galilee, around the Sea of Galilee. And then you've got Syria to the north, the Tetrarchy of Philip. Tetrarchy means literally a quarter kingdom. So these territories are all governed by relatives of Herod the Great, sons and grandsons and stepsons and so on. The Decapolis means literally 10 cities. So that's where the demoniac of Gadara or Gerasa was. Jesus told him, "Go home and tell what great things God hath done for you." And he was from that territory, and his testimony spread through that whole region. Perea is right here. Judea, of course, is the heartland of Judaism and the power center for Sadducees and high priesthood and money. And then Idumea down here. If Jews are traveling between Judea and Galilee, how do they normally do it? So they normally cross over here go up here like this. They don't go through Samaria. That's why Jesus' disciples are astounded when he says, we're going through Samaria. That's not normal. So this is and all of this is owned by Rome. All of this territory and much, much more is owned by Rome. Here is a model of Jerusalem. It's actually in Jerusalem. You can go see it today. It's a scale model, and it's great because the builders have done a fantastic job of recreating topography and buildings to the best of their ability at the time of Christ. So you're looking at a model of the temple. So here's the temple proper, and all of this is Solomon's porticos or Solomon's porches, apartments and storage rooms for tithes and offerings and so on, all the stuff, apartments for the high priest and guests and like that. And you're looking at the court of the women over in here, and the court of this would be the court of the Gentiles, court of the women, and the court of the men, I think is how it goes. There would have been a barrier there with armed guards and signs saying, don't go beyond this point for Gentiles. But there is a prominent building that you can see right here. See the four corner towers? And notice how it's taller than the temple. That's the Antonia Fortress. There is a Roman garrison there, probably had at least 1,000 soldiers in it. And Herod built it. Why is it there? If a rebellion or a riot or guerrilla warfare is going to start, this would be a premier hotspot. So there's always a Roman lookout watching whatever's going on down there. So, they've got their eyes open at all times, what's happening. Any unusual knot of people forming, any loud noises, any weapons. And they actually have a secret entrance. They have a way to get out of the fortress right into the temple courtyard. We'll see that here in a couple minutes.
What direction were you looking at?
Yeah, let's see. I believe that we are looking from the east. We're looking from the east towards the west. So behind us and a little bit to our left is the Mount of Olives. And down in front of this is the Kidron Valley. So it's a pretty steep valley. It goes down a couple hundred feet. And the Kidron Brook is at the bottom of that. So the Kidron Valley is right in front of this wall in our foreground. And then what's called the upper city of Jerusalem is behind. So this is the upper city. Down in here, down below is the Kidron Valley. If you see pictures of Jerusalem today where a gate is blocked up and then there's a cemetery in front of it, that cemetery is a Muslim cemetery, and that gate is the eastern gate. And so that might be, or either that gate or one underneath it, would be maybe where Jesus is coming back to enter Jerusalem. So here's another shot of the same thing. So we were looking at it from over here, Mount of Olives, looking this way. Now we're looking from the opposite corner, and here's Robinson's Arch and a bridge to the upper city, and over there's the Antonia Fortress, the temple building right there. This one's set up a little bit differently than the last one. So take a look in Acts chapter 5. The Jewish territories were among the most restless in the Roman Empire, Acts 5, and look at verse 34. And this is in the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin, there's a physical council chamber building in Upper Jerusalem just outside the temple. But a Pharisee named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, respected by all the people, stood up in the council and gave orders to put the men outside for a short time. And he said to the men of Israel, take care what you propose to do with these men. For some time ago, Theudas rose up, claiming to be somebody, and a group of about 400 men joined up with him. But he was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. After this man, Judas of Galilee rose up in the days of the census and drew away some people after him. He too perished, and all those who followed him were scattered. I read these verses to remind you there were many, many rebellions or attempted rebellions going on a lot in Israel and in other places too, but Israel was like, a boil that never healed. And Rome is always saying, how come those Jews don't ever get along with us? Just do what you're told, knuckle under, and you'll be fine. And the Jews never would. And so there's a constant unrest, kind of a rippling undercurrent of anger and resentment going on all the time. Acts 21. Go to Acts 21. Here's another example. Acts 21 and verse 31. While they were seeking to kill him, so this is Paul in the temple courtyard. Somebody saw him and knew who he was. They thought that he'd brought a Gentile into the court of the Jews, and he hadn't. He had done no such thing. But Jews around him start shouting and hollering. They go and grab him. They're starting to punch him and beat him. And the lookout on the Antonia Fortress Tower saw this and said, we got trouble right now. And the commander, who was on duty, took a squad and went down the secret stairs, went into the courtyard and grabbed Paul to get him out of there. So here's a little bit of that in verse 31. While they were seeking to kill him, a report came up to the commander of the Roman cohort that all of Jerusalem was in confusion. At once he took along some soldiers and centurions and ran down to them, and when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the commander came up and took hold of him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains, and he began asking who he was and what he'd done. Verse 35, when he got to the stairs, that's a set of stairs that's inside the fortress with a door that you can open from the inside, but you can't open it from the courtyard side. So it's a secure door. They're taking him back inside the fortress. And this is where Paul says, hey, can I have a minute to address the crowd? And the commander's shocked because he can speak Greek. And the commander says, so you're not that Egyptian who led a bunch of guys out in the wilderness? And Paul says, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not Egyptian. I'm a citizen. I was born in Tarsus and so on. But here's another, this is another possible rebellion from the point of view of the Romans. This is a riot that could get out of hand. We don't know what this is, but we're keeping an eye on it. Go to Acts 23. And here is Paul, whose nephew has uncovered a conspiracy to have him assassinated. And so he has his nephew speak with the commander of the garrison in Jerusalem. 23 and verse 23. And he called to him 2 of the centurions and said, get 200 soldiers ready by the 3rd hour of the night to proceed to Caesarea with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen. They're sending 470 soldiers to guard one guy out of the Jerusalem garrison. So, they're taking it very seriously. They don't know what this is, but they're responding to what they see as a threat. And they're doing it with overwhelming force. So the Jewish territories were restless all the time. And the Romans are watching constantly. What is this? What's going on? So Rome imposed its laws on the Jewish territories, although they allowed the Jews to observe their religious practices. All those we've seen, they keep an eye on it. Most Jews resented the Romans and their presence on their land. Taxation was a particularly bitter topic. So on top of regular taxes that the Jews would have to pay anyhow, the Romans imposed their own taxes. And some of what they did, so the road from Capernaum to Damascus, there was a toll booth there, and the toll operator was a guy by the name of Levi. We know him by another name. What's his other name? Matthew. He was charged with collecting toll money for the Roman Empire. Now, some toll collectors would not just collect what was required, they would collect an additional surcharge. Guess where that went? Yeah. That's another reason why taxation is a, you know, I'm not sure, has taxation ever been popular in any culture? You know, but for the Jews, they really didn't like that. There's another reason why the Jews resented taxation. Can you guess what it is? What is it? It was not equal. It wasn't equal. It could be whimsical, especially the toll booth operators were especially hated because today it might be, I'm going to charge you by the pound. Unload your cart, we're going to weigh it. Tomorrow it might be by the axle. And so they would kind of use their authority to just goad people. Another area that caused resentment was the tax collectors are working on behalf of whom? The Romans. They're collaborators. Think of World War II in France. How did the French resistance view those who cooperated with the Nazi puppet regime? They hated them. Same thing here. So there were groups like the Zealots who were ultra-nationalist, and they hated both Romans and any Jews who collaborated with Romans. A subgroup of the Zealots called the Sicarii, they were like the resistance in World War II. They carried out assassinations, literally. So language. Latin was used for official government business. However, Greek was the lingua franca. Greek was the language that most everybody knew. So across the empire, from Great Britain to India, people were speaking Greek. Now they all had their own individual languages too, but Greek was the language that people used for commerce and trade and education and so on. So in Israel, Aramaic continued to be used, and educated Jews would read and write Hebrew too. So this is a reconstruction, possibly, of the inscription over Jesus on the cross. The top line is in Hebrew. Hebrew, as you know, reads from right to left, opposite of what we do. The next line is Greek, and that would be Jesus Nazarenus Basileus ton Judaion. So Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And then you can probably kind of puzzle out some of the Latin on the bottom line, including Jesus, Nazarenus, the V is a U, Rex. What's Rex? King. King Judaiorum, King of the Jews. So that's a decent, I can't vouch that it's totally authentic, but a decent reconstruction. So rich Jews built Roman-style houses and villas. The rich, as is true in every culture, oppressed the poor. Slavery was extremely common. You know, when you start reading through Paul's epistles, you figure out pretty quickly slavery is everywhere. It's just common. There are more slaves in the Roman Empire than there are free men or other classes. Somebody has suggested that in the city of Rome, I think 3/5 of the population were slaves. So a huge percentage of slavery. So Roman religion, Romans were polytheistic. They believed in many gods. In any given town or city in the empire, one could find many temples and shrines devoted to various deities, also in some locations, cellars of small household idols made of silver, stone, wood, etc. So in the city of Ephesus, people were getting saved, and there was a silversmith whose business was casting small silver shrines of Artemis of the Ephesians, Diana, a goddess. And they would sell those to travelers, to pilgrims coming to the great temple. And he brought Paul and his team up on charges, saying, these are guys who are trying to shut down our business because they're teaching that gods made with hands are no gods at all. Well, so there's this business that's built on idolatry. The Roman pantheon of gods included Jupiter, in Greek we know him as Zeus, Mercury, in Greek we know him as Hermes, Diana, we know her as Artemis in Greek, Mars, in Greek Ares, many, many more. And some of these are mentioned in Paul's travels. Some of these gods are mentioned as people are worshiping them. And they did. For a long time it was thought that Romans in the first century AD didn't actually believe in the Roman pantheon. More recent research has shown they really did. They really were, most were quite sincere that these gods are real. Also, the mystery religions rose in prominence. Very quickly, the Pax Romana means the peace of Rome, and it refers to a time period as well as kind of an ethos. By the late Empire period, Rome had made or improved more than 250,000 miles of roads, 50,000 of which were stone paved. Here is a stone paved road in Pompeii. You might be able to make out, it's got ditches on either side. Why? Rainwater, it's ditch. It's to carry water away. They know how to crown it. So the middle is higher than the sides. The water runs off. And it's got bollards. So you can't drive your chariot past this point. Pedestrians only from there on out. They are magnificent engineers. Maybe that's one of the things that Romans did better than anybody else. They could engineer like nobody's business. And so the roads, a road network, all over the Mediterranean world, 250,000 miles of it. They brought citizenship, law and order, general peace and security. Now we've already seen there were rebellions. So this is in a relative sense. But relative security, relative peace for inhabitants of the empire. Prosperous stability. In the Roman Empire, people did financially, now we're not talking about slaves, but people did pretty well. There was a lot of commerce and trade. And the lingua franca, the common language, Greek. We, as Christians, would say the Pax Romana is not just a function of political and military power imposed on the Mediterranean world. We would actually have a different view. What would we say about the Pax Romana? God engineered it at exactly the right point in history so that Paul and Silas and Barnabas and Christians spreading out from Antioch could travel on good roads with relative security to take the gospel all over the world. And when they traveled, they would have a scroll or a sheaf of parchments that was the New Testament written in Greek that most anybody anywhere could read. And so the lingua franca, Greek, the road network, the peace to be able to travel safely, it's part of the function of the Roman Empire, but it is also the grace of God. I'm over. I thought I didn't have enough material. Let's close in prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for your sovereignty at work down through history. Thank you for the day together. Bless our time, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.